We have here Professor Petra Steinmair-Pösel from University College from Austria. And thank you for agreeing to make this interview with us. So let me start off by asking you, how did you first hear about Professor René Girard?
Well, first, thank you for having me. And yeah, that's quite some years ago. Actually, it was in the late 1990s when I was a young student of theology at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. And I attended a seminar on psychological mass phenomena. And the seminar was co-led by a young assistant professor who had just returned from Stanford, and he had been there for a research visit, and every other sentence of him started with the words, "Oh, to this René Girard would say," and "to that René Girard would say." And the young assistant professor then, of course, was Wolfgang Palaver, and he had just come back from spending time with René Girard. And maybe it was not every other sentence, but quite a lot that he mentioned what Girard would say to this and that. And to be honest, by that time, I was a little bit annoyed because I hadn't heard about René Girard before, and I didn't know who that person was. And I would have wished to hear what Wolfgang Palaver said to, to those things. But nevertheless, it sparked my interest somehow. So what he told about Girard sparked my interest. And a little bit later, when I returned from an Erasmus year in Dublin, I went to another professor of mine, Josef Niewiadomski, and I asked if I could be admitted to his Girard reading seminar, even though it was already in the middle of the semester. And he agreed, and I started with this reading seminar, and they were reading Violence and the Sacred. And of course, for me as a latecomer in this seminar, it was a little bit difficult, but I really got hooked by mimetic theory, because there were so many answers to questions of mine included in his theory. And like many other of my colleagues, I started attending this René Girard reading seminar for many years. And even though we didn't have to do it for our studies, we went there every other Tuesday evening for 3 hours to read and discuss Girard. And I must really say, Josef Niewiadomski was an excellent professor and interpreter of Girard, and this was a great time. And we really got into Girard's thinking. And then later I wrote my master's thesis about quasi-religious myth in Western economics, and of course that was also inspired by Girard's thinking and Paul Dumouchel's and Jean-Pierre Dupuy's book L'Enfer des Choses. And when I later became a university assistant myself, I was allowed to co-teach the Girard reading seminar with Josef Niewiadomski, and so working on mimetic theory really shaped my understanding also of theology. And I was lucky to be able to study with Raimund Schwager, of course. I attended all his lectures that I could because I was so fascinated by his interpretation of, for example, Christology and doctrine of original sin. Which was, of course, inspired by Raimund Schwager's understanding of mimetic theory. And yeah, so then I got to writing my doctoral thesis on theology of grace, inspired by Girard and Schwager. And so this really got me into mimetic theory.
Theology of grace was your dissertation?
My dissertation was on the theology of grace, right? And what I really tried to do, because I was writing it just at the time when Raimund Schwager died, and there had not been a resume of his work done before. So I did that a little bit, and I tried to apply what he had developed as dramatic theology. What he had developed for Christology to the field of the doctrine of grace.
I see.
Understanding grace and the experience of grace as a dramatic process, so that you don't only experience grace as some positive emotion or something that uplifts you, but maybe also as something like critique or judgment, depending on the situation where you are in the drama of your own life.
Did you ever meet Professor René Girard?
Yeah, I met him several times, and the first time I met him was at the cover conference in 2003 in Innsbruck. I had just started working at the University of Innsbruck as a university assistant, and one of my first assignments there was to organize with Wolfgang Palava and Dietmar Regensburger this conference on the topic of passions in economy, politics, and the media. And this was wonderful because it got me to meet all the cover people in a very short time. And as I was quite shy at that time, being a young student, a young doctoral student, it was also a great opportunity because all the people were writing to me with their own questions concerning organization of the conference. And when we met, we all said, "Ah, you're Petra," and we were in the middle of a conversation already. So that was really, really a great start, and some kind of grace maybe for me to get into cover like that.
How old were you, if I may ask, when you met him?
I was 27 then.
How old? 27?
27. I had finished my master's degree and was doing my doctoral studies, and it was that conference, and yeah. And he was there, and that was the first time I met him in person.
So how did he strike you?
I was really fascinated because I had read his books, and he was this great professor whom everybody knew. And when you met him, he was really very, very humble and accessible and talking to everybody. And maybe I can tell you another time I met him was 3 years later at the 2006 cover conference in Ottawa. And Ron Redekop had invited me to give a plenary lecture there on positive mimesis and grace, because I had just finished my doctoral thesis. And while I had always enjoyed reading Girard, I always also wondered how his theory could not only be applied to understanding the conflicts and rivalries that we experience, but also how it could contribute to show us a way out of those conflicts. So, of course, preparing for this lecture, I read Rebecca Adams' interview with him, but I also, in a way, felt, well, he doesn't focus enough on the positive side of mimetic desire, and I wanted to point that out, and I criticized him a little bit for neglecting that. And as you maybe can imagine, when I was standing there in front of the auditory as a 30-year-old young scholar, criticizing Girard, having him sitting there in the audience, my knees really trembled. But that was another incident when I met him, and he was really, really humble. I mean, he was very humorous, and I don't remember exactly the words he said then, but well, I felt that, yeah, he listened to what I had to say, and he was very, very kind and humble in his reaction. So wonderful. That's one of the main impressions I have of him, and also that he was very unideological. Some of his critics say that, well, he's so, it's in a way quite ideological, his thinking, but he as a person, I think he is never, I never experienced him as.
I see. So, do you ever remember any advice he gave you?
No certain advice. I have a book signed by him where he writes, I don't know if you can read it. It says, for Petra, a faithful companion of the mimetic theory with best wishes. So I interpreted that as an advice to be a faithful companion of mimetic theory. And I tried to be that, maybe say that was an advice. Yeah. He was not he was not directly my teacher or my professor in that sense. So, yeah.
What's your favorite book of his? Do you have a favorite book of all the books that he wrote?
I think that's really difficult because, of course, I very much enjoyed reading Violence and the Sacred, which was the first book. So it was my start into mimetic theory with that book. But another book as a theologian that I recommend most frequently to colleagues and newcomers to mimetic theory is I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. Because I really think for theologians that's a very accessible, good introduction into his thinking. And as the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk once said, or wrote in his epilogue to the book, it's like a scientific version of the doctrine of original sin, eine wissenschaftliche Fassung der Erbsündenlehre in German. So it is a way to also bridge the gap between science and theology, and yeah, in a way, getting an idea what, for even an atheist or an agnostic, what could this Christian theology mean also for a non-believer? So I really like that book for those reasons. And I also very much appreciate Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, because it taught me a lot about human desire and also psychology in a way. And it also, especially in the end, highlights the importance of metanoia, of conversion, and of grace, which are very important to me. And they, in a way, build a bridge to topics that interest me very much, which is also mystical experience or the experience of grace that I dealt with in my doctoral dissertation. So I like those, I like others as well. I find Battling to the End extremely important when it comes to present challenges like the environmental crisis, for example, and questions related to that. It's really hard to name one favorite book of his.
Right. What was your take on Battling to the End? Do you have an opinion on Battling to the End? It was probably his most difficult book, I would say, wasn't it?
Yeah, it is very difficult, and I'm not sure if I completely understood everything he wants to say in it. But for me, as a social ethicist dealing with the topic of environmental crisis and questions related to that, I think it's really interesting what he has to say about about what it means that the institutions formed by a scapegoat mechanism are crumbling, and that we are in a way in a situation of escalation to the extremes. Also in terms of, production, consumption, destruction of environment, and the advice that is somehow included in the book. How can we deal with that? So basically, important keywords for me there are innermost mediation and the notion that we cannot leave behind mimetic desire, but that we have to live with it, that we have to be very careful about our choosing our models, and that I really think that his notion of imitating Christ and finding, when he talks about innermost mediation, he quotes Saint Augustine. saying, well, you could call this kind of imitation innermost, or you could call this innermost mediation, in the sense of Saint Augustine, the Deus interior intimo meo, the God who is more internal to myself than I am, and also to every other human being. And that's very close to what the mystics call the mystical experience of God within and God within every other human being. And that this is really one key of dealing with our environmental crisis, because we all know what we should do and what we should not do, that we should consume less and, for example, and be a little less mobile and so on, but we don't do it. And we don't do it because of all this mimetic rivalries and trying to be better than the others and so on. And to get over that, I think his insights are really key.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. You certainly are quite a Girardian scholar and very faithful to the Girardian theory. So thank you for taking the time for this discussion and sharing your thoughts and memories on Professor René Girard. One last question I have. Do you have any books or any projects you're working on right now?
Well, I just finished my habilitation, which is kind of the second doctoral thesis that you have to do in the German-speaking countries to be a professor at a university. And I wrote that about the relationship between spiritual and mystical experience and social political commitment. And of course, all the things that I mentioned right now are in the background, because I always wonder what helps us act differently. And I think one main thing is, well, getting to this point of innermost mediation or mystical experience that really allows us to engage in the world without resentment and in a more constructive way.
Well, thank you very much, Petra. I really appreciate your time, and hope you have a wonderful time the rest of the day, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much to you too.